Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is the culmination of our latest quarterly theme on here at the HGN, Historical Games Network. And this quarter, our theme has been development, a theme that is obviously relevant to every single historical game, and therefore, presumably every person interested in historical games. So I hope you've enjoyed the posts we've had over the past couple of months. And today we're hoping to explore these issues in more detail with our guests. But before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the fact that today's event is funded by the Birmingham Centre for Media and Cultural Research at Birmingham City University. So a big thank you to them for making it possible for us to do this. So now on to the lineup for today's discussion on our development theme. We're very lucky to have three excellent speakers for you, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about each of them. So first of all, we have Sarah Cole, who has worked across the heritage and creative sectors for over a decade, in roles including game designer, narrative designer, writer, and creative technologist. Her best-known projects with her creative heritage consultancy, Time Image, include the digital excavation of the British Council's archive film collection and Poetic Places, an innovative geo-curation app made in collaboration with the British Library. Sarah's work in games is usually under the banner of Patchwork Fez and encompasses experimental personal video games, board games, and RPGs, as well as client work. In 2020, she created the Wood Sorrel Garden Gallery, a public art gallery within Animal Crossing. She also facilitates fringe game events, including Now Play This and Feral Vector, and runs her own annual event, Trick or Retreat. Sarah has most recently been working as narrative designer and writer on in-development studio title Wholesome Out and About. We also have Sadia Gardizi, who is a journalist and political cartoonist from Pakistan and a PhD student at Warwick University. Her research is focused on political cartoons during the War on Terror era, exploring how they create imaginaries of security and nationalism. She is the co-founder of Project Dastan, an organization that records oral histories of survivors from the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, and reconnects these survivors to their ancestral homes across the India-Pakistan-Bangladesh borders using VR and other new technologies. She is the producer of the award-winning VR docudrama Child of Empire, and has written and produced animated shorts about South Asian stories. We also have Maurice Suckling, who is currently an assistant professor at RPI in upstate New York, where his research interests are storytelling in games, board and card games, storytelling in games, board and card games as storytelling systems, and history in board games. Maurice's first game was Driver in 1999. He has worked on over 50 published video games, mostly as a writer, including Fortnite, Killing Floor 2, Borderlands the Pre-Sequel, and Civilization 6. He also designs historical board games and is a Charles S. Roberts Award winner for his Chancellorville 1863. He holds a PhD in creative writing from Newcastle University and a master's in global history from Birmingham University. So as you can see, we have a great lineup for you today. And without further ado, we'll move on to our questions, after which we've discussed all these. Of course, there'll be an opportunity for our audience to forward some questions that they'd like our guests to answer. So please feel free to put those questions in the chat as we go along. Okay, so without further ado, question one. Are there particular advantages to having history or particular historical periods or settings as the thematic focus for a game in comparison to sort of more generic games design? What opportunities does history as a theme, as a narrative element offer in terms of development? And maybe we could start with Sarah there.
I knew you might. So there's a few potential advantages as I see it, to focus on the more practical side. If you are drawing from a historical time period when you're making your game, you don't have to spend loads of time writing all the lore for that period and inventing the narrative backstory for the world. You do have to research it, of course, but you don't have to build it from scratch, which can be an advantage, could be a disadvantage. That's probably a different question. And in the same way, you potentially have art assets you can draw from that time period. So, you know, if you're making Assassin's Creed Odyssey, kind of know what Athens looked like at that point in time, which is, I forget exactly when it is actually, 500 BC, somewhere around there. And you can do that to the extent where somebody like me watching somebody else play can go, oh, you're in Athens because I recognize the Hephaestion. Like there's a known style to things, there's familiarity. And sometimes you can even reuse actual assets. So something like the game Procession to Calvary, which is a relatively small game, chops up open license artworks from the Renaissance era and animates them into a game, which is incredible. Or something like Apotheon, which just heavily riffs on the style of ancient Greek pottery and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And I can see the connections there with your post that you did for us, where you sort of talked about even in a sort of fantasy setting game, you can draw from real history to sort of help you flesh out the lore and the setting and things like that. Yeah, it's a really good point to think about that in sort of this pre-packaged wealth of influences available in historical game making, so to speak. Sadia, maybe we could come to next. What are the advantages of having history or particular historical periods and settings as the focus for a game?
Thanks, Adam. I think for me, for my work, Child of Empire, history was the point. We try to tackle a history which is very disputed in two countries that are basically see each other as enemy states, India and Pakistan. And you wrote about modeling history. I read your post, and in the sense that we were actually modeling history, not the game, but we needed to find a revisionist history where we could help people engage with the history through gameplay, through VR, through the animation. So we kind of had this twisted around. The gameplay was not the point. The point was how can the game or the VR walkthrough help people engage with this very specific, very dramatic history. So I think it was, for me, history was very, very important because this was kind of a retelling. And this was a retelling away from like the national histories, the textbook histories. And what do those look like? And so they were based in oral history accounts to create that type of feel of empathy. So I think for me and this type of a project, this was kind of a re-engagement with history through gameplay rather than the history setting up the context and the environment for a game.
Yes, absolutely. I could see that with your project, which is very much sort of about trying to find a way through the maze of the sort of the dominating narrative that sort of promoted conflict between the sort of two sides. So I think your answer is great there because it sort of highlights the fact that we're never talking about history, we're always talking about histories, right? It's always about trying to find a path through those things, and hopefully games can help us do that in a variety of ways. Yes, so Maurice, in your opinion, what are the advantages of history as a thematic focus compared to the wealth of other types of themes we see in games?
Yeah, let me just double down on what has previously just been said. I agree with both those comments in terms of a coherence for a design identity, the huge advantages there. And as Sadia said, yeah, in a way, the question can be flipped around insofar as for many people developing their history games, it's the reason you're making the game is because of the history. The reason you're making the game in the first place is because you want to engage with it. So there is no game without you attempting to engage with history. So it's not so much an advantage. It's just a core part of the identity of the entire project. And yeah, as I said, I agree with Sarah's comment about kind of a sort of design identity cohesion. If I could try and offer anything else, I suppose it would also be that there are huge marketing advantages in terms of there's an identity not only for your team to develop, as Sarah was talking about, but also there's an identity for your audience to attach to and engage with. They see a cover and they have an idea or an image that means that, oh, there's a way to kind of monetize this because there's an audience there. It's also possible that there's an advantage in, we see this in more what I would term Euro games in the board game world, where your selection of a historical theme or topic can actually be supporting your design mechanics. So if you're making a game that's really about trick taking, about building a deck of a tableau of cards and building tricks out, that's just a trick taking game, right? But if you sell it as Rainer Knizia effectively did this with a game called Battle Line, you sell it as, well, hey, it's a war game of sorts where I am trying to put my cards in the right places to build the right tricks at the right time. It becomes more coherent for your audience. They're not just thinking, oh, it's a trick taking game. You've got some idea what to put on the cover. You've got some idea about how to engage with them and get them sort of switched on to what it is you're trying to do. That's not the same thing as it being a game that actually is seriously attempting to engage with history. But it is a potential way to leverage history for design purposes.
I think that's more common in board games than video games, where the setting influences the mechanics.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of point to hit on, is that sort of notion of engagement. It's exactly what was talked about in relation to history and film, you know, in the sort of literature about that, you know, a couple of decades ago, was very much that idea of, look, this is a really good way to grab an audience quickly. History has this sort of this quality, and you know, film and games obviously have that quality very much so.
Yeah, it's like a free license, right? It's basically,
yeah.
You know, I can't afford a license for Star Wars, but you know, if I could, there's no license on medieval Europe, so that's leverageable. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's Salvati and Bullinger, I think in the Playing with the Past book, they sort of talk about this concept of sort of brand World War II, you know, where it's, you know, these have become brands through their sort of reproduction in collective memory and their sort of reduction into very particular imagery or narratives or whatever. So there is an immediate appeal there. So I can absolutely see that. I think it's a really important sort of aspect not to overlook. Okay, thank you very much for those insightful answers. So rather unimaginatively, the second question is going to sort of pose the opposite to that, which is, conversely, what are the specific challenges that face developers of historical games compared to other types of games? You know, what are the things that make you think other developers must have it easy when they don't have to deal with these historical elements that we have to deal with? And maybe we could start with Sadia. What are the challenges? What are the limitations that history as a theme introduces?
I think, again, it's very case specific to my work, which is, as I said, kind of retelling a history of two nations, fraught nations, you know, who and there's history of hatred, there's history of war, there's immigration issues between the countries. People can't visit back and forth, even though, you know, they may have migrated from either territory. For us, a lot of the challenge was deep-rooted prejudice against each other. For Indians for Pakistanis and Pakistanis for Indian, which basically when we're writing this VR walkthrough, how do we give equal weight to both sides of the narrative, and what does that weight even look like? And if there's a backlash, which sometimes there is, especially, you know, with online hate, how do we deal with that? And, you know, what is the story we want to tell that we can, you know, say that this is our take on the history? So I think there's for us there was very deep thought about the social, the cultural, the religious discussion that such a walkthrough may spark for people, and what does that look like for then retelling South Asian stories, whether it's in those territories or whether it's in places like the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see that. You know, the advantage of something like Star Wars, as Marie said, is that, you know, people do get outraged about it, but, you know, not in real terms. Of course, real histories have, you know, real emotive contexts, and particularly with histories where the sort of causal connections to the present are still very apparent, you know, to contemporary politics or contemporary sort of cultural contexts. You know, this is obviously a really difficult sort of minefield to kind of walk through. So I can absolutely appreciate the challenges of that, and any developer that sort of deals with sensitive historical topics, particularly where there are various stakeholder groups, holding completely different positions from each other. It must be a very difficult sort of path to weave, if you like. Okay, maybe we could go to Maurice. What specific challenges does history introduce as a theme for development?
So an obvious topic, of course, is to do with accuracy and authenticism. I think I'm going to, if my telepathy is working, I think I'm going to let Sarah talk about that, because I think that she's probably got stuff to say about that. But another topic that I think is related but somewhat different is the issue of determinism. So this comes into play when you look at game balance. So intentionally or not, whenever you have balanced a game, and I'm tending to talk more here about analog games, when a game is balanced, you are saying something to do with the nature of determinism, to do with what could be changed and what could not be changed. And this is potentially highly contentious philosophically, and perhaps in terms of details too. So when you're making a game where history is involved, you are involved in the debate about how deterministic history is and on what points it hinges. This is not obviously an issue that you're really dealing with if you're dealing with a purely narrative game that is not attached to history in any way, or a game where it's your own sort of fictional world. There might be relationships between history and your fictional world that might be all too apparent for some people, and that might be an issue, but nevertheless, the central issue here is to do with the fact that game balance is not purely game balance. It's you're entwined in the nature of determinism, and where you kind of pitch your flag on how likely it was for something to happen, or how likely it was for someone to win a war, for example. And that's contentious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good point to sort of bring up determinism, because I think the interesting thing about the discussions we have in history about causality is that it tends to be about human agency versus large-scale structures. Was this inevitably going to happen, or did a person have to make a decision, or a group of people have to make a decision? And that is the very essence of games, right? It's the combination of the human agency of the player and the structure, the larger scale structure of the rules. And I think it's really important to sort of talk about determinism in games, that that is probably the thing that games make the most claims about in history, right? That's their sort of USP, in a sense, is that they are similarly rule-based structures for when we're trying to talk about, does the historical process have rules? So I think that's a really good point to bring up. I like that a lot. I also loved your point in your blog about the fact that balance doesn't necessarily mean symmetrical starting positions, for example. That balance can involve asymmetry between players. I think that's a really good point to bring up, actually, because very few conflicts in history were fought from symmetrical positions, so it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, pretty much none.
Yeah.
So it becomes a sort of a channel to work within, where you want to stay. You want your players to feel as if that there's sufficient breadth of possibility that the game can be engaging, and yet you don't want it to fall outside of that channel where you feel as if your thesis of sorts is really broken down because it's not supportable. So it's a sort of a needle that you're trying to thread as a designer, is to kind of deliver both those things, some agency, but also stay within the right framework of your thesis. But agency in and of itself is not necessarily even what you want as a designer, as a developer. That's to say, you don't necessarily want it unconstrained. Your thesis might be to do with how constrained actors were in an historical moment, in which case you're doing a poor job of designing an historical game if your players then have complete free reign within that system. It might be absolutely what you're trying to do as the designer is ensure that you've hard baked that constraint into the agency in order to deliver your sort of coherent thesis and what it is you have to say about that historical moment.
Absolutely. I think that tension is the sort of really interesting space actually between those sort of competing elements of games that make them such sort of a vibrant medium, when done well. Okay, Sarah, what are the challenges that face developers of historical games compared to other types of games?
Lots of good points there already. I did also know about the tension, but I kind of had a slightly different angle on it, which is the key thing that makes a game different to a film is agency. It's one of the things. If you're picking a historical setting for your game, that's one thing. So there are lots of board games that are in historical settings. Palazzo, you build a Venetian palazzo. But there's no narrative attached to that necessarily. You are not playing specific people with palazzos, if that makes sense. You're not named individuals from history. Video games tend to be more about you are this character and you're existing in this world in this time frame, and here's probably your narrative to go with it. And of course, there are different interpretations of historical events and that sort of thing. But you have things like key events happened, for example, this person was assassinated, this building was built at this time. Those things don't get to change, but you're working in a medium that is all about the players making decisions about how things pan out. So there's a constant design tension just there. So Assassin's Creed handles this by, if you go too far off piste, it goes desynchronized, and they have this whole you're in a virtual reality thing, which allows them to mitigate this problem constantly. And there's all these other little quibbles about it. But if you're working with any kind of historical setting, there are so many design choices and things that have to go with it. Because we talked a little bit about the audience before, and an audience that's already kind of invested in that time period maybe and is interested in playing. They might be really invested. They might be quite vocal if you are not choosing accuracy. I can't remember the game, but I went to a talk once and the creator was talking about, it was a World War II game. They're talking about how some of the players were complaining that they thought the Allies, one of the Allied guns, which was meant to be equivalent to the Axis gun, wasn't the same. The stats were the same. And they were like, well, what do we do? They changed the noise the gun made to resolve the problem. And people went, great, thank you for fixing it. It's much more balanced now. And so there's all these little design choices that have to kind of tie in, and you have to decide how accurate your game's going to be. You have to work out if your mechanics fit it, because a lot of historical video games could have another setting slapped over the top of them, and they would still work. Games that have history as a design pillar, so as a core feature of it, are a very different kind of kettle of fish. So something like Sadia's game is about that thing, but some games are just choosing to use history because it works for various other reasons, not because it's necessarily about that time period, if that makes sense. It's about the gameplay, which is not the same thing. And of course, I guess the major challenge or disadvantage is that you have to do an insane amount of research to make sure you're getting it right, or that you're deliberately getting it wrong. I believe the Vikings TV series does a lot of research and is not accurate, but that's a design choice that they've made because they think it'd be more interesting or more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think.
Sorry, my list of disadvantages was much longer than my list of advantages, but they're not necessarily as quantitatively disadvantageous as.
Yeah, even if there's more of them, they may not outweigh the.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I can see your point, absolutely. And I think it's sort of interesting to talk about the tension between the narrative and what you want to allow the player to do, and how do you resolve that player agency. And I think it's often helpful to think in terms of narrative levels. That like Oh, well, maybe
tabletop
with characters.
RPG games are their very own thing in this field, and we would probably need a whole other session to get into that one.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's always a really interesting thing to think about. And, you know, I find it interesting, those sort of linear narrative games where they have to contend with, okay, the player's actually not going to be allowed to change anything here. You know, I think of sort of classic games like, you know, Call of Duty, you know, those kind of World War II first-person shooters, for example, and then you get this minimization of, you know, what your choices are, and your choices, you know, you survive or you die, you know, and that's the effect of you on history kind of thing.
Creating the illusion of choice is a very particular skill that a lot of games lean heavily on. Yeah,
absolutely. And yeah, absolutely, and often very successfully. You know, it's sometimes when you look back on a game experience, you realize you haven't really chosen much, but somehow you've had a good theme park experience.
Well, it's wildly like creating something that truly branches off and has lots of different endings is an insane amount of work behind the scenes. It's very difficult.
Yeah, because it's exponential, right? You know, the more choices, the more choices.
Yeah, and even within a limited scope, if you have, it depends how much you're changing. If you're changing in the entire state of the world, you've got all the different assets, you have all the different dialogue, different characters, different places, different quests. It's a bigger problem than it looks like a lot of the time. Yeah.
And then what are you going to do? You're only going to do that with economies of scale. I mean, you'll probably only do that if you're talking about a major franchise. Yeah. In which case, what do you do on game 2 then? Which ending do you go with?
Yeah.
So which ending do you go with the previous one to set the story up for the next one? It's a big problem, because in effect, if you say, well, we've gone with the canonical ending, so therefore the canonical beginning for the next game in the sequel, you're sort of diminishing all those other choices that players made in the first game, in which case, why don't we just save ourselves all of that work, all of that bother, not just the design, but also the testing and everything else, to just kind of trim it down to, well, it's going to funnel down to this one choice at the end of that game 1.
It's almost like trying to write a time travel story where the things that happened in the past have already happened, but you don't realize the first time round, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I've always felt very betrayed when I played an RPG series and that happens, you know, when you've had this, you know, world-shattering decision at the end of the
Mass Effect 3.
Yeah, well, that was the series I was thinking about, to be honest. I always felt very betrayed by that.
Although to patch it was received so poorly.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah. Okay. So moving on to our next question. What opportunities do you think that games could open up in the future in terms of ways to engage with the past? Are there any current trends in terms of technology or design patterns that might influence this, in your opinion? Where do we think games are headed? What do we think they can do next in terms of allowing people to engage with history in perhaps new ways, perhaps deeper ways, perhaps more widely available ways? And can we start with Maurice there?
Sure, yeah. Well, I believe everyone's getting their own holodeck next month, so that's good news.
I certainly hope so.
So VR is obviously a space where we can expect some things to happen. It seems churlish to think that they won't, but exactly when and in exactly what form, I don't know. But you know, watch this space, because something is going to happen there. I think kind of looking the other way, in a sense, looking into analog games, I would say that there are some trends that are happening, again, related to economies of scale, because it costs much less to make a board game than a video game. We're seeing, for a number of reasons, not just economies of scale, but some other reasons too, we're seeing games moving into a variety of more diverse topics. So we don't just have history games, which is you can recreate World War II. You know, we don't just have World War II anymore, or the sort of the big well-known wars. We also have smaller wars. We also have not wars at all. We have games about women's suffrage. We have games about the opium trade. We have games about the British East India Company. We have this is really something that's emerged over the last 10 years or so. We're seeing a huge kind of plethora of games on a variety of quite unusual topics, kind of quite obscure in their own ways. And I think that this is going to continue. This is to do with the economy inside the board game industry. It's to do with the way that Kickstarter or those kinds of platforms allow publishers and designers to find audiences. It's to do with the way in which wargame kind of philosophies are engaging with Euro mechanics that are allowing us to conceive of history, not just in terms of units moving across a board, but also actions and meeples and this kind of grammar that we've taken from Euro games is kind of blending in all sorts of fascinating ways that are giving us ways of representing all sorts of other aspects of history. Like I said, sort of not necessarily military at all. And even where sometimes there's a game like The Grizzled, which is a game about World War I, isn't it's not a war game at all. It's about surviving the war, and the historical perspective on that is to do with the kind of lived reality, if you like, of kind of how it might have felt to be wanting to survive the war with a group of friends. It's a co-op game. So that's what I see happening in the board game world.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think in a sense it's sort of happening in digital games as well, though perhaps less, a little bit behind, but there's sort of in the same sense as Kickstarter has done for board games, the sort of indie game.
Yeah, we see it there. Yeah, We the Revolution would be an example. The Darkest Through the Darkest of Times.
Exactly, yeah.
We have examples of these games that are moving into territory that's less well trodden. But yeah, just the economies of scale will just mean that it's just, there's going to be a disparity between how fast and how fast board games can move and how they can move into such unusual spaces. That's just the reality of the different industries, really.
Absolutely. It's way easier to take it easier, but it's less of a risk financially, of course, to just try and out their concept in a board game than it is in at least most video games. Absolutely, I can see that. But I do sort of wonder about how much audience makeups or audience interests are changing as well. It seems like even in sort of relatively mainstream digital game spaces, there is at least an appetite for new historical experiences that perhaps wasn't there sort of 10 years ago. So I'd be very curious to see sort of more sort of research done on that. Okay, so we have Sarah next for this. Where are we headed? What's the future for historical games? What do you think they might offer us in the sort of coming years?
Well, I was just going to pick up something you said there about different types of historical games. So there's one that came out recently called Pentiment. I think I said that right. Haven't played it yet. Here it's great. It's you're a 16th century Bavarian monk or something, and you start the game by scrubbing the text off with a pumice stone or something, which is apparently what you would have done in real life. So there's all sorts of great stuff there, and it's a murder mystery. Apparently it's wonderful. Go try it. But that's on Game Pass on Xbox. Like, that's mainstream. I don't know how big the game is, but I was going to say that the game making tools are becoming more accessible, and this is a good thing. Even something like Unity or Unreal is more usable and accessible than it used to be. But there are lots of other game making tools, things like Bitsy, Twine stuff. Anybody can make a game now, essentially, and there is a growing wealth of these micro games and small games and things that are either made as hobby projects or come out of Kickstarters and things like this. So I expect to see that continue to grow. I think it's worth saying that games do not equal technology, and a lot of radical change in games seems to be driven by changes in technology. So VR is probably picking up because the headsets are becoming much more accessible and user-friendly than they were. I have an Oculus development kit one in a box up there. It's huge. It's got 700 cables attached to it. It's very unwieldy. But the MetaQuest, which is the modern iteration of it, is very easy to pick up and play, and still very expensive, but that'll probably come down. So that will change what people are making, because the way you make a game for VR is very different to how you make a game for a flat screen, because you can't be guaranteed that the player is pointing the right way at any given moment, for example. So you can't have a set piece and force the camera to go there because they're looking the other way. So there's all sorts of stuff like this. I was also going to say that tied into that, because more people are able to make games, we're getting a wider variety of voices from people making games, which is great. So you're starting to hear stories that would not have gotten the funding before, probably should have, but there's so many interesting things coming out, telling new histories that you wouldn't have gotten before, basically because the barrier to entry has dropped a little bit and it's not being gatekept by massive publishers and stuff. There's also
absolutely.
AI, but who knows what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, yes, a new kind of worms. Yeah, I think the point about Pentiment is a really good point. You know, the fact that not only did it launch on Game Pass, but that it was considered enough of a draw for Microsoft to want that for Game Pass and promote it. You know, and I think even 10 years ago that wouldn't have been, you know, a big draw for a company like Microsoft. I really don't see.
I'm not sure it would have been made 10 years ago.
Yeah, perhaps not. Yeah, perhaps not. Absolutely. And if it did, it would have been a minor Steam release. It wouldn't have got, you know, a major console release, as you said. And, you know, it seemed to have been hugely well received. It's got, you know, incredible review scores across the board and lots of sort of buzz about it online. And that's, yeah, as you said, that's I think that's a really good sort of watershed moment, actually, a game like that making it to a big console. We also have talked a lot about VR, so I think we should come to Sadia, who can tell us, is VR a part of the future of historical games? Where are they going to go next?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call this a trend, but here's what I've noticed. What we try to do and what I've seen something happen in the VR space has been kind of releasing the archive and animating the archive and playing with an archive. So for us, it's oral history archives of migrations from 1947. There was a conference in Hamburg where I saw someone talk about uranium mining in South Africa, and that archive and those oral histories that they put into a kind of a VR gamified experience. So a lot of these historical experience, they're not exactly games, playable games, but there's something there with releasing the archive and putting in this new technology for new exploration rather than just, you know, an academic exploration. So a lot of our partition archives from 1947, they sit in universities. There's two big organizations in India and Pakistan, but then there are these very boring textual archives that people, even if they have access to, it's just not interesting enough, sadly to say. And I think what we're trying to do is kind of like putting up a shiny veneer and saying, hey, here's a cool VR set, it's going to be amazing. And then when people watched the movie, they were like, oh my God, that was so emotional. And like, did this really happen? It becomes a learning experience by proxy in a sense. So I think for younger generations, yes, you know, we've got a lot of interest from schools. School trips come to see our VR thing if we put up a tour in various places. So there's educational interest for VR. And I also think there is something to say about ageism and games and how inaccessible they become to people people who are older. But the way that we did it was kind of putting it in the face of people who were in their 50s, 60s, whose parents migrated, to say that, hey, this is your story. Have a look, here's a VR set, you know, and kind of introduce a new technology to these people and tell a story that they can access. So I think there's a lot of scope with, you know, what's missing, you know, the regions that are missing, like, you know, places like Pakistan, a VR game of Pakistan, who's interested in that, but also like who's watching it. Are they kids? Are they older people? And like, you know, so I've seen that in at least our kind of very niche space of post-colonial discussion about, you know, lesser developed, lesser known stories.
Yeah, I think there's some absolutely great points in what you said there. You know, there's sort of issues of accessibility, both in terms of opening public access to existing archives or resources or sources, but also, as you said, the sort of ageism of gaming. Then VR, with its so much more naturally intuitive sort of motions, is sort of opens up that access. I'd never really thought about that before, but that's a great point, actually, particularly for the sort of audiences you were hoping to engage with initially. That's such a great step actually to make. Yeah, and I think VR is, as Marie said, we're all going to get holodecks next month, right, with the PSVR 2 coming out, and that sort of seems like a moment that's another sort of watershed moment for VR, when the major console developers obviously put a lot of money into it at this sort of point, and there's a lot of sort of excitement about it. It's curious to see what people will do with that in the future, and I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for sort of reenactment-based engagement with history through VR, because you've got that sort of scale. The perceptual information is obviously much more similar to the experience of the historical actor, we can assume. It opens up a lot of opportunities. I think VR is an exciting sort of thing there, definitely.
I think even if you're watching a film in VR, the act of watching in VR is enough agency for people to feel like they're involved in it. Yeah,
absolutely, and it has the same advantages of sort of cinema. It puts off extra perceptual information you don't need, your peripheral vision, that kind of thing, and you become more engaged for that reason. It's I think it has some really interesting psychological implications, the sort of VR experience, that I think inevitably will impact the way that people experience history, or even things like cinema. Okay, I think we'll ask maybe one more question, and then we'll turn to questions from the chat. Okay, I think we've sort of started to think about this a little bit in our discussion, but also I think there's more we could say. So we often talk about the future of games in terms of how production will change, which is sort of what we were really talking about in the last question. Do you think there are any changes in audiences and their reception practices that might influence how or what historical games get made? What's changing in who is playing these games, their demands, the sort of tensions between various stakeholder groups online, etc. Maybe we could go to Sarah this time.
Sure. I think the relationship between developers and players seems to me to have radically changed, especially in the last few years, particularly with video games. In a lot of cases, development is more public. So the game I've been working on, Wholesome, there's the studio has a TikTok and asks people, what do you want to see in the game? Do you think we should be doing this? Which is a bit of a double-edged sword, because if they say, I want to be able to pet a deer, you then have to seriously think about how you're going to implement deer and petting them. But a lot of games now on Steam are in alpha or they're in beta. And one of the, it's been out on Steam for a couple of years now. One of the top-selling games is called Phasmophobia, which is not a history game, but that's still in alpha, despite selling over 2 million copies and things. And there's a lot of this sort of thing. And so games are getting more feedback while they're in development. And this changes player expectations for the game, but it also can shape the game itself, because if players turn around and go, well, actually, I hate that you've included accurate blacksmithing in this game, you then have to seriously think about whether you're going to cut it. Whereas previously, it would have stayed in unless it tested badly, it would have stayed in longer and things like this. And I haven't personally experienced it, but I can easily imagine very core elements of your game changing through this kind of feedback process. And you've also got a much wider audience as well. I was listening to a BBC programme that aired a couple of days ago about video games and architecture with Adrian Hon amongst other people on it. It's quite good. I haven't finished it. But it opened with the statistics that I think in the UK specifically, just under half of 45 to 74-year-olds play video games regularly. And I assume this includes casual games like merge games on your phone, but that's still a much higher percentage than you might have imagined. So you have an aging player base, potentially, which isn't to say that the young people are not playing video games. I just mean that you have a wider spectrum of people playing. But you also potentially, video game industry burnout aside, have the people who were playing games when we were young are now the people making games, which changes what gets made as well. And that's why there's a lot of nostalgia for games that were out in the 90s, because people are like, I loved it, let's make it again, which doesn't always work, because a game that was good in the 90s is not necessarily good now. So yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
a bit of a
definitely.
ramble there.
No, absolutely. I think that that sort of reboot culture that has sort of infested cinema has definitely made its way into games now, or remaster sort of culture. You know, we're seeing more and more versions of the old games sort of remade, which I think is interesting, because as you said, that's about shifting audiences, right? They're growing up looking for that nostalgic experience of their sort of teenage years or whenever it may be. So it's sort of a history in games related point, even if it's not about history in games. So I think that's absolutely an interesting thing to bring up. Yes. Sadia, what do you think is going to change with audiences, or is there any reception practices sort of changing that you can identify? Is there anything you saw with your game?
I think people didn't know they were interested in this kind of history, this strange history about, two migrants from India and Pakistan. I think what I found was there's a need for some kind of civic and political re-education. So our game kind of tackled the issue of empire. It was called Child of Empire, which is why it got some traction in the UK as well, because of these discussions about the colonizing, the curriculum, the colonial thought. Starting off with throwing statues in the river to stuff like Cecil Rhodes statue, etc. So I think we kind of wanted to bring that discussion to the forefront in a new way, and reintroduce some ideas of the end of empire in South Asia, that this is a very, very important history, and this is world history, this is British history, this is not just the history of India and Pakistan. So to kind of create that conversation and bring in those audiences, along with maybe less represented groups, less represented histories in gaming, VR, and tech. There is virtually no such industry in Pakistan. There's obviously programmers and there's work going on there, but it's mostly kind of outsource work from the West. And India, we already know that's the story. So what are our stories? Can we make games and experiences that are about our stories and our stories, not global stories? And I think that's the kind of audience we were looking at. Of course, some of those games exist. I think there's a strategy game about Indian empires and the Mughal Empire, but they're not very mainstream. So I think for me, it's about how can these new technologies and our interventions bring in those kind of lesser represented group stories, and can we talk about how those are also global stories, and they should be of interest in the West, in other contexts, and and how does the story of migration and decolonize and translate for other communities across the developing and developed world.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's I think the right game intervention at the right time can change the audience for future game interventions, right? And I think I really enjoyed in your work how you highlight the fact, as you said, that this is not just a story of India and Pakistan, it's a British story as well. And I think in the UK we have a tendency to distance from that discourse, because it touches upon sort of the history of empire and colonialism and things like that, that are obviously sensitive topics and aren't discussed enough. So I really enjoyed that in your work, how you brought that out, and I think your game absolutely shows that sort of element, and that there are audiences out there that need to engage with these things that aren't currently. So yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect of your work. Maurice, what do you think is changing in audiences, in reception practices? Obviously, there's been an explosion in interest in board games over the past 12 years. Is that something that's going to continue? Is that something relevant?
Yes, yes, I think it will continue. actually, I'm going to talk first of all about technology and say that the ubiquity of high quality technology through engines and through high quality dissemination of art, I think is meaning that the differentiator is connected to design and connected to narrative, and that's what people are really interested in. That's kind of where I think there's a growth in that kind of appetite, and this then connects back to the point I was making earlier about, well, this is also part of the reason why we're seeing this appetite explode into such a diversity of different topics. And yes, to Sadia's point, this includes post-colonial topics, which I think that in the historical board war games sector, or really sort of conflict simulation is a better term, I think, because it doesn't foreground the warmongery and kind of focuses on the modeling that's being attempted, the attempt to seriously engage with history. So conflict simulation is a term I think is sort of better. In that space, I think we're actually roundabout at a post-colonial moment there, where there are serious attempts to come at these familiar narratives from non-colonialist perspectives and to try and give voice to historically disenfranchised people. This is something that we're not really seeing in the kind of mainstream board games space, and it's kind of rather well trod terrain as people berate Puerto Rico for its considerable historical shortcomings. In the conflict simulation space, we are seeing some ways. We're seeing, the Red Burnous is a game that just came out about the Algerian war, the French invasion of Algeria, but you don't play as you play as the Algerians, kind of cooperating together to try and survive the French. And we see this perspective. There's a whole series of games which are called coin games for counterinsurgency games that GMT Games have been publishing for about 10 years or so now, that find ways of tackling these topics of conflict, not just from an imperialist perspective, but from other dimensions too, often not to do with winning a war, but how you energize a populace, how you energize a population to engage in a conflict. And there's a lot more to be said about the kind of provenance of that kind of design work. But so we are seeing that. We're seeing this in other aspects too, to do with stories connected to the feminism, like I mentioned earlier, the Votes for Women game that Fourth Circle just came out with, and there's other games on that topic too. We're seeing there's a game development called Molly House about being a gender-defying queer in 1720s London and surviving, and sort of a semi-co-op game in that realm too. So yeah, I think that in connection with what I was saying earlier about how the economies of scale of the board game world are allowing us to now have these such a diversity of different kinds of topics from different perspectives, that's just going to keep continuing. I think that's what I see over the next 10, 20 years. It's we often talk about the golden age of board games, and I would say that really it's never been quite as golden as it is now, in terms of just the amount of stuff that we have that, like I said, not all of it is treating history with a degree of seriousness. Some of it is really leveraging history for its own design and marketing ends, but some of it really is interested in history first of all, and is leveraging that interest as its primary concern. Its primary concern is to engage with history in some serious way and extract the stories and allow people to engage with stories that are less well known.
And that's the thing as well. It's like, even if we're talking about this in terms of design, what these games offer, clearly the appetite is there because these games are being successful, and the other developers are looking at this and going, hang on, there's a space for us here to make games on similar sort of non-hegemonic topics and have it potentially be a success or reach an audience. So there is clearly a period of change going on, very much so.
Yeah, because we've now got, we don't just have games where I try and defeat someone else You know, we have games that are semi-cooperative, that are entirely collaborative. We have games that are solo games. We have games that you know, can only facilitate 6 or 7 players, that have different degrees of cooperation that is necessary in order for the game to kind of function. So all of these different kinds of play styles are adding to this kind of rich tapestry of possibilities that exists for designers and players now.
Yeah, and that sort of that cooperative model in board games is something I hadn't seen, particularly in a lot of mainstream games, until maybe 10, 12 years ago. And it does seem to be huge now. And it does, of course, open up all these opportunities in terms of representation of history, where you don't want to just represent something simplistic like a battle necessarily, or, you know, simplistic, but something that has 2 defined sides, that you might want to instead represent something that has a variety of stakeholders. And it's interesting because that seems to me almost to be kind of inherited from digital games, you know, that for a lot longer had those cooperative models where we play against the rule system itself as a group of players to try and achieve a goal. I mean, maybe that's just I don't know enough about the sort of less mainstream board games that have been out there for a longer period. But
well, no, you're right. In terms of co-op board games, you're really going back about 10 years, and there's not much before then, at least to my mind. I'm happy to be corrected about that, but yeah, it's really sort of about 10 years ago is when we start to see that emerging.
I think you're probably right with that trend. The event that I started running last year, Trick or Treat, essentially turned into 3 days of everybody playing board games. And between 22 people, we bought 100 board games to this thing, but some people were specifically saying, can we bring cooperative ones, because we would prefer to play in that style. So I can't think of any of them that are super cooperative, but that are historical. But I can see that being an interesting combination.
Yeah, the Grizzled is one I was just talking about earlier, which is cooperative. There's a game by GMT Games called Churchill by designers Mark Herman that's it's about World War II, but it's a 3-player game. You play as either the British, the Americans, or the Soviets. You play against the game system trying to defeat the Axis powers. What's interesting about that is that not only is it cooperative, but also it's actually semi-cooperative, because you're trying to win the peace after the war. So it's interesting to think about, you know, military history is sort of engaging because it's seductive, because it makes us think in terms of neat beginnings and endings. And then, you know, the war's over, Germany's defeated, Japan's defeated, and then what? You know, you count your points. But in history, of course, it doesn't end like that. What happens? What happens as the World War II kind of segues into the Cold War? Well, this is a game that in some ways allows us to think in those terms. So it's more uncomfortable in terms of its definitive kind of narrative, familiar kind of endpoints. So it is sort of asking those questions as we realize, oh, well, it's a good way of representing the kinds of concerns that the various leaders had at that time, that it wasn't just about defeating Japan and Germany, it was also about figuring out what the world looks like after the war finishes. So I don't know, I went slightly off on a tangent there, but yeah, so that's a semi-cooperative game that's kind of doing different things.
Yeah, it sounded really interesting. And that was you play at the conferences, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the fundamental part of the game is you at the various conferences trying to win issues in order to move the grand strategy meters, such as they are. And you ultimately lose if you win too hard, right? Because everyone else, the other 2 guys are like, you know, will not stand for it. So you have to win, but by not too much.
So you have a shared goal and an individual goal, and that shows the bridging between sort of the history of World War II and the history of the Cold War. And as you said, that you can't tie these up into neat narrative boxes. There's sort of infinite chain of history. And I think it's important to bring up that point as well. You know, the representations are representations, that they create false ends and beginnings, that they reduce everything, and you know, you can do it into a board game and it still be really meaningful despite that reduction, but still it's something we have to be aware of. But I think the thing that comes across the most is that in all of these instances we're talking about, there's this sort of subversion of existing meta-narratives that have been allowed to blossom throughout popular historical media. And now forms of play are starting to subvert in ways that seem entirely appropriate to play itself. You know, play is supposed to be subversive and sort of upturn the normal order and be carnivalesque. So that seems to work very well. Okay, we have some questions from the chat here that I would like to pose to you all. So we have a question here from Jason Scott. He says, I wondered if there was a tension between casual games, whether digital or pick up and play 20 minutes analog card board games, and the capacity to explore history in a complex or revisionist way. Do we need very in-depth games to sort of have these games that subvert and that revise our existing sort of grand narratives, or is that something you can do in a quick experience? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that they want to come in with. We can sort of go in any order for this. It seems
Thinking
difficult.
faces.
Well, let's say I'm trying to think of an
I
example.
don't think there's inherently a reason why they can't. It depends on whether you're focusing on a narrative kind of thing. Right, this is just depends on if we're talking about like a video game on your phone that's like an idle game or something where you check it once a day. There's the potential to do a long-term narrative thing with it. I think I can't say I play a lot of them, but it's a design choice. I guess it's whether you can make the thing you want to convey engaging or not in small bites.
Yeah, ultimately, I guess it depends what you term complex. So a 20-minute play experience, depending on your definition of complexity, might be mutually exclusive. Like it just might not be possible because 20 minutes is what you might need to be able to explain what the components of the game actually are. Again, I was thinking really in terms of board games, but in terms of the capacity for a relatively casual game to engage with revisionist topics or certainly more obscure ones, that's totally theoretically feasible. I just saw on that chat a reference to Black Haven, which doesn't strike me as being particularly complex from what I understand about the game. It seems like a walking sim of sorts, but you know, completely capable of engaging with revisionist topics in that format. But I can also imagine, I can imagine relatively casual analog games that could tackle topics that are unusual. I'm working on a game right now about the 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth, which was the treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War. And you know, in conflict simulation games, we often think in terms of, like I was saying earlier, sort of beginning and endings of wars, and that's kind of that war ends and then job done. Well, here was a treaty that needed to be signed in order for the war to be concluded, but neither side wanted to give on it. So how do you get from that situation to a week or so later where people sign a treaty and the war finishes? That kind of focus allows us to think again about how history isn't definitively it's changeable, right? It's not that there are contingencies in these things. It wasn't the case that the war happened and then of course there was going to be a peace treaty and things moved on. That of courseness is something that this kind of focus allows us to bring to bear, you know, on that topic. So I wouldn't say that's a particularly complicated game. There's only 12 issues that were negotiated, and it's a game that's played in about half an hour. It's a relatively simple mechanics as you kind of bid for different issues. But does it have the capacity for us to think in revisionist ways about the nature of history? Yes, somewhat. Does it allow us to explore a topic in an unusual way that re-engages an audience with that topic beyond just thinking, oh, they signed a peace treaty because they'd had enough? they hadn't entirely had enough. There was a chance that that war would have continued, and in all its all the terrible ramifications of that too. So yes, in theory, yes, and I'm also saying in some specifics, yeah, I can absolutely see ways in which that could be pulled off.
Yeah, and an example I think of, which we've talked about a few times actually in our discussions, but it is one of those sort of limiting cases, if you like, is Brenda Romero's Train, and the sort of board game about the Holocaust, which is designed to be.
I was trying to remember the name of that. Yeah.
Yeah, designed to be played in about 20 minutes, and it doesn't subvert Holocaust narrative so much. It's really a reiteration of the banality of evil concept. But I think it is definitely formally subversive in the notion of what actions players will engage in without reflection, or what games should or could represent. So I think that would be my sort of pick up on that. That is a relatively casual game, not played in a casual setting so much, but short, easy to play, that had a sort of a rather revisionist component, I think. So if there's anything anybody else would like to say about that, or we can move on to another question. So we had an interesting question here from Jack Orchard, who says, it's a broad question, but primarily for Sadia. I'm wondering about the relationship between historical games and their capacity for producing empathy. Sadia mentioned Child of Empire having a profound effect on older generations from India and Pakistan, but I was wondering about the type of experience it might engender in white British players. I know there's been a lot of discussion in relation to queer identity in games about the limited capacity for games to generate real empathy rather than a self-congratulatory, I've played a game now, so I understand oppression kind of narrative. I wondered if this tension also emerges in historical games explicitly designed to provoke empathy with particular communities. Sadia, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of empathy is very interesting, because that's where we started off in our development, that how do we create an experience for empathy? Because there is partition fatigue, at least in India and Pakistan with people. You know, there's countless movies, literature, there's a lot of work. This is like your national history. So there is fatigue, there is a numbness about like, so what, millions of people died, kind of, so what, that's just how it is right now. So how do you rebuild that empathy, which we was very good in recreating, kind of putting you in the footsteps of a migrant, taking you along the ride, showing you a train with dead bodies, and and also playing with religious symbolism to get that feeling of empathy out. So I think it did work with Indian and Pakistani audiences, but as far as white British viewers, yes, there is that element of, yes, I've gone to this niche art gallery to see this VR experience, and that was really cool, and that's the end of the discussion. But then there's also some, for some people, some form of re-education that happened. There was this white lady, who it was just under the impression that violence was just one way, with just Muslims on Hindus when those migrations happened, right? And because she never heard kind of the Pakistani or the Muslim narratives, it was a strange experience for her, because she had a chat with us after that. You got the history wrong. It was just Muslim on Hindu violence. So those kind of issues also come up that are built through just decades of different kind of socialization, misunderstanding of South Asian history, misunderstanding of Islam, sometimes stuff like Islamophobia, the issue of how slurs in the UK are often about being Pakistani. They're not about being Indian. So I think there's a very deep, complex issue here of the white viewer viewing narratives from the global South, or from South, especially in the UK, where 20% of the population is of South Asian descent. That there is scope for re-education, there's scope for some type of really important debate. But then there's also like I saw this cool experience, and it's more about just something woke that I did. So I think it's a very interesting question. This tension did emerge for us between empathy, education, and just like, is this just another film that's going to be obscure and strange for a white viewer? and how do we draw them in? So the film kind of starts off with this big cutout of Churchill, and Churchill has like, a puppeteer, which may make some white audiences uncomfortable. This another look at empire in World War II and what it did to South Asia. So I think it's important, and I think people like my projects that's kind of here in the UK, to have that conversation and to put those marionettes of Churchill in charge of the Bengal famine in front of people and ask them to question what they know about British history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's about multiple experiences sort of crafting together a narrative. It can't all rest on your game. That's too much expectation, right? This has to come from multiple angles, and there has to be a sort of context of this is stuff that should be taught in history curricula, in the UK as well, considering it's very much British history, as you pointed out before. And so it's difficult. But I think also the question of sort of empathy and narrative is not a new one. Bertolt Brecht struggled with exactly this issue. He believed that theatre, made people too sort of it was too cathartic. It didn't really engage people. They went to the theatre, they saw the show, they became politically engaged, and then the curtain drops, and that's a nice little package. It's tied up. Well, now we can leave it. It made people complacent, and his epic theatre was about destabilizing that. So I think in a sense it's not a new question that's game specific, even if it is a very relevant question. Did Sarah, Maurice, did you want to?
I just wanted to say, yeah, absolutely, to do with the it helps that there's an exposure to these kinds of narratives, it's breadth of perspectives, right? That's one thing that games can do. Does it necessarily engender empathy? No, but it's a start, hopefully. The other thing I was going to add was that certainly in board games and in those conflict simulation games I was talking about, there's a strong tradition of solitaire play. And that actually can be a space that's fruitful for recollection, for kind of moving carefully through a topic. For the people who play these sorts of games, very often engage quite deeply with the history. They read the historical notes that designers provide, and they spend some real time with those game systems, not just thinking in terms of, oh, can I beat the game and let me put it away. That often the kinds of play styles that we see from those kinds of players is often highly engaged with the narratives and the histories concerned. So that can be a space where we might expect some empathy to develop in ways in which might not necessarily in a competitive game setting or a multiplayer game setting, perhaps.
And I was just going to say, more generally, video games in particular do have a different emotional palette to things like films because of agency. It's difficult for it's harder possibly for a film to make you feel shame, to make you feel pride, because you didn't necessarily do the things that you're seeing on screen, or you might not feel like you did. Whereas a game can make you do terrible things or make you make difficult choices, and then they become choices that you have made, and that means that you are much more tethered to the narrative and the storyline that you're existing in. I think I heard the developers of Dishonored 2 talking about this. You go through a warehouse and there's an animal suffering, and you can press a button and end the animal suffering, but you are looking it in the eyes while you do it because of the way they've set it up. And moments like that mean that you can make games that really hit people and stick with them, but it's not necessarily easy. Just because you can do it doesn't mean it works. So if you can bring historical narratives into that sort of mechanic, that sort of gameplay, I think they do have the potential to stick with people for quite a long time. But every player is different, so there's no guarantee. Absolutely,
and I think it's absolutely something games open up for, and I think it's something that the game industry works hard against, in a sense. Sort of Emil Hamar, who wrote a great piece for us in this theme, sort of talked about moral disengagement factors, you know, that because games always have that sort of culpability of, oh, well, you have to go out and, you know, do this violent behavior or whatever. They have a lot of these factors that are put in place as to why that's okay. So I think there's a really interesting tension there that absolutely it's a capacity of the form, but also the industry has had to work against that so that you still feel like the hero sometimes, you know, that you.
That's what kind of game you're making.
Exactly, yeah, very much so, very much so. Okay, so we have some more questions. So we have a question from Tony Gilpin, who says they're interested in history-based video games that are not war-related, or at least not combat-based. So I wonder if you might all name some of your favorites. I'm playing Pentiment right now, and I've also played things like Svoboda, 1945, Blackhaven, Papers, Please, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. What are some others that may not have been mentioned? So is there any favorite non-war or combat-based games?
80 Days.
Oh, good choice. Yeah, would you like to say a little bit more about that for the people that don't know?
Yeah, 80 Days is, I think, in my top 3 of games, totally. It's an incredible piece of work. There's nearly, there's 800,000 words in it. So it's primarily a text game, but it's animated, it's very well put together. It's by a company called Inkle, written by John Ingold and Meg Triumph. And they took the Jules Verne story 80 Days and they basically created a playable version of it, but they've expanded on the universe and they've looked at the original material and gone, this is very of its time, we can do better. And they have. So you have the opportunity to visit all sorts of cultures around the world. Some of them are fantastical. You will encounter like 3% of the content in any one playthrough. So you can play it many times. It's very good, and there's no combat in it, but it's very engaging and well written. So it's quite different. If you're looking for something that's a bit more like RPG style, then it's not that, but it's certainly kind of set in a historical time period.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that game as well. It was something a little bit different, and again, the way it sort of subverts the colonial tropes of the original around the world in 80 days. It was really good. I would, for my own part, I would say games that aren't conflict or yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's not quite a history game, but I think it very much relates to history and the issues that history deals with, which is the democracy series, which is where you get to be in control of a democracy, basically. And it's very simple interface, but it has an enormous complexity and depth where you can just basically set policy for a non-specific society of your own making. So it's not overtly historical, but it's absolutely dealing in exactly the kind of societal and cultural and political structures that have very much determined the world we live in and continue to do so. So I'd say that's a non-conflict based game that definitely has historical implications as the democracy series. Maurice, Sadia, any suggestions?
I'm just going to mention a few board games that are sort of non-conflict related. There's things like, I haven't had a chance to play it yet, but so Free at Last game just came out by the Dietz Foundation, and it's about the civil rights struggle in America. There's a game that has been out rather longer called Freedom Underground Railroad, about antebellum US Civil War and about freeing slaves. There's a game called Versailles 1919, which is about the treaty, and you're playing as the Allied nations negotiating that treaty. The war is finished, but you're trying to kind of come out of that treaty doing well, whatever that might mean for your respective sides. So, and I mentioned previously the Grizzled, which I really enjoy as a game about war at all. It's really about friendship, I would say, and surviving. those are a few, not necessarily all my favorites. Some of them I'm kind of still wanting to get to, but there's, like I said, there's an increasing number of games which are not really about military history at all, but are leveraging some of the philosophy that has sustained that side of the hobby.
Yeah, I loved the Grizzled. Actually, I've played that. I thought it was a really good game. I find it interesting how it, in a sense, it sort of echoes the narrative style you tend, not the narrative style, but sort of the narrative focus you often see in war movies, where it zooms right down from the sort of geopolitics of the conflict, or even the sort of ideology behind it, and just looks at the relations between the ordinary people forced into those kind of extraordinary circumstances and then have to survive them. And it's sort of, I find it quite cinematic for a board game because of that reason, if you know what I mean, even though it's sort of a relatively simple sort of visual experience. I really enjoyed that game. Sadia, did you have any games you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
I'm going to fish out of water here because I'm not a big gamer or a big game designer. But I love you know, new ways to tell narratives, which is how come I'm on this panel. And for that, I think, you know, I most recently what I found absolutely wonderful was this Instagram story post, and it's just this long form, half animated, half textual story. It's called His Name Is My Name. And it's about this woman who's realized that her grandfather was a Nazi officer, and her dealing with that past. It's just wonderful the way it's told in you know, this environment where everything has to be fast, and on Twitter and on Instagram, and things disappear unless they go viral. And they've instead used Instagram as kind of a long-standing format for a story. And it doesn't get updated anymore because the story is complete. And I love this idea that in a world of fast-paced, like narrative virality, they've kind of used the same platform to tell this wonderful story about the Holocaust, and just found a new way to say something.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely fascinating. We've also had a suggestion in the chat of The Cat and the Coup, which is a great game. I've played that as well. So I can definitely recommend that one.
Just thinking about a couple of others. Return of the Obra Dinners set is a mystery game and is somewhat fantastical, but is set on an old sailing ship. It is rather neat. Is Kentucky Route Zero set in the past, or is that technically set now? I still haven't gotten around to playing it because I'm a terrible person.
I think it's contemporary, but I'm not sure because I haven't played it either. Who knows? It's been on the list for a long time.
Procession to Calvary I've mentioned before, and is literally made out of Renaissance paintings. So that's fairly historical. I'm not sure about Pathologic 2, but I'm not sure it might have combat in it, but it's not combat focused, I don't think. I think it's about dealing with the setting that you're in. I think that's historical, but you would have to check. I think you can also now wander around some of the Assassin's Creed stuff in like history mode and avoid getting stabbed. And just
the discovery mode,
stuff.
It's all curated by mythologists. Okay, we have another question. I think it will probably be our last question because we've only got 6 minutes left. When trying to tell histories from non-traditional viewpoints, it's often the case that you can't always rely on historical sources as they tend to be heavily biased. What kind of resources would you use to ensure a game you make remains faithful to the people you are trying to represent? So obviously this applies throughout a lot of historical context for various marginalized groups, whether that be, you know, sort of women in the medieval period, or, you know, sort of colonial subjects, or whatever it may be. Often these people obviously don't have as much of a presence in the sources, or at least the sources that survive or are lauded. How then do you find that voice? How do you ensure that what you make remains faithful?
Yeah, good luck. It's hard, right?
It's a tough one.
I mean, I get. Sorry, go on, Maurice.
No, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, depending on what you're doing, you might have recourse to for there to be interviews that you can conduct that give you some source material that way. But it's a genuine problem. You know, been working on a game about the rebellions in first century Roman Britain. And not only do we have few sources, but essentially they're all Roman sources talking about how terrible the Britons are. The Britons, of course, didn't write stuff down. So what can you do? You can extrapolate. You can leverage the things that you can be more sure about, like just some archaeology that tells us something, and you can try and read into those written sources to try and ascertain why the Romans were reacting in certain ways. They had a problem with women who had leadership positions. So they make a big deal about Boudica. They make a big deal about Cartimandua. We can try and extrapolate something about that. How fearsome they were, how afraid they were, how unusual this was for the Roman mentality. But we're sort of clutching at straws, really. We're sort of looking at archaeology that survived and thinking, well, this was important. We're looking at things like, well, they built roads right through Stonehenge, so this was an attempt perhaps to control the power of the space, of the landscape. It wasn't just necessarily about getting from point A to point B, but I don't have a really good answer, because I don't think we have one. I think that it's just hard, right? In that instance, we can't talk to them to check. In other instances, in more contemporary contexts, that can be a possibility, and you can engage with historical consultants and they can help you. You can engage with some of that community directly. But yeah, I think I'm going to let someone else speak.
It's more about skills than resources, I think, isn't it? Because it's about looking at your source material and going, do I know enough to feel confident that I'm interpreting this correctly or that this is right? My degree is in classical civilization, and that's functionally a creative writing degree, because you look at all these resources from very long ago and you go, these are probably not right, but what seems correct, and what can we look at? I think half of it is being aware that you've got a problem potentially, and in more contemporary contexts, if the communities that are represented in it still exist, get in touch with them, get them involved, get them on the team. There's no substitute for that. Like, I'm aware working on things that I'm very white, very middle class, very English, despite my best efforts. Like, I know that I don't know enough to do certain things. So I go find other people who do. Like, that's it. Sorry.
Sadia, I mean, obviously you could do some interviews kind of thing, but I guess there was also a sort of lot of lost experience of people that weren't necessarily live anymore that you had to sort of.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the official historical sources are not it, because those are very we like, if you look at India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and you mix all their official histories, maybe you will get some form of like a holistic history, but that's just it. I never learned about Hindu empires and pre-partition Hindu culture in Pakistan, and the same goes for my Indian counterparts. There's an erasure of Muslim rule and the Mughal Empire going on in India currently as we speak. So one way to do is obviously for community representation, just go out and get those interviews. We did a lot of oral history research and new interviews. For that, it's again, as Sarah said, talk to the experts and figure out who knows that story and how you can get at that story. And I think it's there is that gap or tension here. I think it is a tension between, of course, our Child of Empire is also semi-fictionalized. It's based in actual history, but these are fictional characters. So there is that liberty taken to provide the viewer with an engaging and empathy building and experience that also has, some beauty in it. I think there's also a lot to say about then the artistic license that exists within gaming, within writing, to make people connect with that. And maybe that's more important than that factual accuracy that we're looking for. But we just want to get that feeling, that authentic feeling of well, what did a migration in 1947 look like? And it's not a literal migrant's journey. It's a symbolic one, because when people die in our animation, their bodies kind of dissolve into verses from the Quran, and it is that kind of storytelling that maybe I feel was more important for us, because we know the story of 1947, but how do you tell it so that it's faithful, as you said, to the people that it's representing, but also it's not just about telling you the history. It's about what does the viewer experience in that retelling.
And I think that says something about sort of the nature of history, even in an academic context. It has these same sort of tensions that leads us to the point where history is inevitably a narrative pursuit. It cannot be a science, because it always involves the decision making. It's always subjective, and there's always a sort of act of constructing it in a way that people can receive it. In a way of using figurative tropes, using compression, using all of these things. So I think it's not so different in academic history from games to some degree, and I think a lot of these same issues come up. That seems like a good place for us to stop. Sadly, we've run out of time. I feel like we could probably go on talking about these issues for a long time. So let me say thank you very much to Maurice, Sadia, and Sarah. You've been absolutely great guests. We've had a really good discussion from you. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me say to the audience before we leave that we have our next theme is going to be alternatives, which we allow you to interpret how you wish, but we're thinking about sort of counterfactuals, science fiction and history, horror and history, fantasy and history. A lot of what we've been talking about today, the way games can provide alternatives to existing meta-narratives or hegemonic narratives of the past. So please look out for that call, which will be up shortly. That will be our next quarterly theme, alternatives. Other than that, I just have to say thank you so much for joining us, as always, both the guests and the panel. What we do at the HGN would obviously be meaningless without your continued engagement. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.